we're going to start doing is now the next four groups, groups 3 to 6, are live presentations. So I'm going to be hosting or transferring over the hosting function to individuals in each one of those groups to present live. These presentations are in fact recorded for your future reference. The first two presentations weren't recorded, but of course those PowerPoints are embedded into the PowerPoint that's on Moodle. So you can obviously take a look at those PowerPoints at your will. Okay, so the next group is the one on the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. So what I need is the name of the person who I'm going to transfer the hosting function to.
Me, sir.
Ripley?
Me, yeah.
Okay, well, let me just find, there you go. Okay, good. Hang on a sec. I lost you. There you are. Okay. Okay, Ripley, so I'm now making you the host. So after I do that, you can bring up your PowerPoint and go forward with your presentation. You're now the host.
Okay. So part of our PowerPoint is audio recording. One of our group members didn't want to present live. So if you can't hear it, just let me know.
Ripley, we didn't hear the first slide.
Yeah, you need to share your audio with us.
Okay, just give me 1 sec.
No worries.
I don't know how to turn it on.
It should
share
be
sound.
under.
I think I got it. I think I got
there
it.
you
1 sec. Okay.
You should need my audio for this. Is there supposed to be some audio now?
Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Presentation by Amy Lindsay, Riley Woodcock, Ripley Levesque, Randy Saunders, Michelle Latham, and Merrick McWilliams.
Sorry, everybody. It keeps pausing my share. Just 1 second.
Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Presentation by Amy Lindsay, Riley Woodcock, Ripley Levesque, Randy Saunders, Michelle Latham, and Merrick McWilliams. The Highway of Tears refers to a 724-kilometer length of Yellowhead Highway 16 that runs from Prince Rupert on the northwest coast of British Columbia to the central interior city of Prince George, British Columbia, where many women, mostly Indigenous, have disappeared or have been found murdered. 23 First Nations border Highway 16. The region is characterized by poverty and until 2017 lacked adequate public transportation, which forced many locals to resort to hitchhiking as a form of transit. The Highway of Tears is infamously known as a dangerous, isolated stretch of highway where hitchhiking with strangers is a common practice for the local First Nation citizens. Since 1969 and until now, as many as 1,811 Indigenous women and girls have been victims of foul play, and in 2015, the federal government launched a national inquiry into these cases. Indigenous women and girls are 5 times more likely to experience violence than any other population in Canada. Indigenous women make up 16% of all female homicide victims and 11% of missing women, even though Indigenous people make up of 4.3% of the population of Canada. In 2014, our CMP operational overview notes that police recorded 1,017 incidents of Aboriginal female homicides between 1980 and 2012, and 164 missing Aboriginal female investigations dating back to 1952. From 2000 to 2014, the average rate of homicides involving Indigenous female victims was 4 times higher than that of homicides involving non-Indigenous victims. British Columbia has the highest rate of unsolved murders of Indigenous women and girls in Canada. The RCMP acknowledges 18 murders and disappearances on the Highway of Tears, dating from 1969 to 2006. 10 of these victims are Indigenous women and girls. Indigenous groups argue that this number is misleading because it reflects only the disappearances and murders that have happened in the specific geographic areas around these highways, and that the real number in northern British Columbia exceeds 40. Inquiry hearings tell thousands of stories of acts of genocide against First Nation, Inuit, and Métis women, girls, and LGBTQIA people. This genocide has been empowered by the colonial structures, evidenced notably by the Indian Act, the 60s Scoop, residential schools, and breaches of human and Inuit Métis First Nations rights, leading directly to the current increased rates of violence, death, and suicide in Indigenous populations. The Canadian genocide targets all Indigenous peoples, Indigenous women, girls, and the 2SLGBTQIA people. Statistics consistently show that rates of violence against these people are much higher than for non-Indigenous women in Canada. Perpetrators of violence include Indigenous and non-Indigenous family members and partners, casual acquaintances, and serial killers. Genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation. It can also be a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. The objectives of a plan of genocide would include actions aimed at the disintegration of the political and social institutions, of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of national groups, along with the destruction of personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even the lives of Indigenous people. Ultimately, and despite different circumstances and backgrounds, what connects all these deaths is colonial violence, racism, and oppression. As Canada is a settler colony country, European nations, followed by the new government of Canada, imposed its own laws, institutions, and cultures on Indigenous peoples while occupying their lands. Racist colonial attitudes justified Canada's policies of assimilation, which sought to eliminate First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people as distinct peoples and communities. Colonial violence, as well as racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia against Indigenous women, girls, and the 2SLGBTQIA people has become embedded in everyday life. Whether this is through interpersonal forms of violence, through institutions like the healthcare system and the justice system, or in the laws, policies, and structures of the Canadian society. The result has been that many Indigenous people have grown up normalized to violence, while Canadian society shows an appalling apathy to addressing the issue. The national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls finds that this amounts to genocide. Indigenous women and girls and the two SLGBTQIA people argue that oppression against them is primarily based on colonialism, racism, and gender, with all factors such as education, income, and ability. In particular, families and survivors consistently refer to the four general ways that their experiences were rooted in colonialism across First Nations, Métis, and Inuit perspectives. These four pathways that maintain colonial violence are historical, multi-generational, and intergenerational trauma, social and economic marginalization, maintaining the status quo and institutional lack of will, and ignoring the agency and expertise of Indigenous women, girls, and the two SLGBTQIA people. Indigenous rights are also rooted in certain underlying values or principles within Indigenous law, mainly respect, reciprocity, and interconnectedness. Colonialization has jeopardized Indigenous women and children and the two SLGBTQI people's rights to culture, health, security, and justice indistinct. Viewing colonialization as a structure means that we can't dismiss events as parts of the past or as elements of someone else's history. This prevents the dismissal of Indian residential schools or the 60s scoop as events that people should just get over. Harmful encounters for Indigenous women and gender diverse people in what is now called Canada started with 16th century explorers who used the terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery to dismiss them as savages and claim rights to the land. Early Christian missionaries then challenged Indigenous women's leadership and Indigenous notions of gender. From 1650 to 1815, there was a middle ground period where First Nations held a fairly even distribution of power with the Europeans. But Confederation in 1867 fundamentally changed this relationship. For First Nations women, the Indian Act tied a woman's Indian status to her husband. Policing was also established to exert control over Indigenous people, particularly First Nation and Métis women, by casting them as a menace to society and stereotyping them as prostitutes. This made it easy for early police misconduct, including rape and murder, to go relatively unpunished. Colonialization refers to the process by which Indigenous people were dispossessed of their lands and resources, subjected to external control, and targeted for assimilation and, in some cases, extermination.
Statistics. Missing and murdered Indigenous women represent some of the highest statistics for violence and death. This has been occurring for generations and continues to affect individuals and families. The 2014 RCMP operational overview shows that police recorded over 1,000 incidents of Aboriginal female homicides between 1980 and 2012, and 164 missing Indigenous female investigations that date back to 1952. And it's possible that the numbers are significantly higher than reported. There have been approximately 4,000 or more Indigenous women murdered or missing in the last 30 years. Accurate statistics for this issue are very hard to come by due to many incidents that are going unreported, as well as cases not being taken seriously.
Between 1883 and 1996, the Indian residential school system enforced a patriarchal Christian dogma that devalued women, enforced homophobia and transphobia, and exposed them to abuse that made them easy targets for abuse from others. First Nations women were also subjected to forced sterilization, further poverty, and marginalization, and were targeted by the 60s scoop and ongoing child welfare policies. Overall, the long history of gendered colonial encounter shows that the policies, practices, and stereotypes confronting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis women and gender diverse people today were put into place long ago. Indigenous ways of understanding land, governance, and identity were targeted by colonizers wanting to possess the land and to get rid of its people. Key encounters, policies and rules, stereotypes and misconceptions were applied differently to Indigenous women and girls, but have impacted each of them in harmful ways. The analysis brings us to the conclusion that violence against Indigenous women and girls is a crisis centuries in the making. The process of colonialization has, in fact, created the conditions for the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls that we are confronting today. Canada's colonial history, now embedded in Canadian systems and structures, and continue to enforce colonialism in ways that lead to violence.
Statement issued by Justin Trudeau in 2020 on the 1-year anniversary of the final report from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women acknowledges that Indigenous women and girls and the people who have disappeared, suffered violence, or were killed, and that many of these tragedies are still existing today. The ending of the national tragedy through co-development and implementation of distinctions-based national action plan is an urgent priority. Issues identified in the National Inquiry's report and calls for justice, developed legislation in collaboration with Indigenous partners, providing financial support to communities, extended support to community-based and specialized services that provide assistance to the families of missing and murdered women, girls, and LGBTQ and Two-Spirit people, working closely with Indigenous peoples and communities to support their efforts. And overall, the National Inquiry has shown us a way forward.
Sir, I would like to add, I hate to jump in, but the Liberal government today released their budget, and in their budget, they put $2.2 billion towards missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls. So hopefully that will help this issue that we have in our country.
All right. Thanks, Michelle, and thank you to the group. I presume you're done now? Okay.
No, we have a few more slides, I believe, sir.
Go ahead then, sorry.
So missing and murdered, current activism and creative response. Since its inception, various organized protests, marches, and vigils and creative events have been organized throughout Canada and the US in support of missing and murdered Indigenous women and children. So the Women's Memorial March, the first Women's Memorial March was held on Valentine's Day in 1991 in downtown Eastside, Vancouver. This area was noted for significant numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Since then, the event has expanded to 22 communities across North America. The march seeks to raise awareness about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and to address stigmas and stereotypes. The Red Dress Project is an exhibit of red dresses that have been displayed across Canada at various university campuses in the Canadian Museum of Human Rights and the Manitoba Legislature. The dresses hang in public spaces. Each empty dress symbolizes a lost, missing, or murdered Indigenous woman. As a symbolic, supportive gesture, one can see red dresses hanging in trees in various locations across the country. Walking with Our Sisters is a volunteer, community-based commemorative project. The project is a stunning collection of colorful beaded and quilled moccasin tops. The unfinished moccasin represents unfinished lives. The display hopes to raise awareness and create dialogue surrounding missing and murdered Indigenous women. The exhibit travels to various locations all across North America.
In our community. In 2019, at my job at the Sault Ste. Marie Museum, I was lucky to be able to help install this exhibition in partnership with the Indigenous Women's Anti-Violence Task Force. The purpose of this display was to raise awareness of gendered and colonial violence against Indigenous women and children. The cutouts of red dresses were used in the Indigenous Women's Anti-Violence Task Force Memorial March for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women on February 14, 2019. The march walked from the Sault Ste. Marie Courthouse to the Delta Hotel. Thanks to the efforts of the Indigenous Women's Anti-Violence Task Force, February 14th was declared the National Day of Action and Remembrance for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Group in Sault Ste. Marie. A proclamation was made by Mayor Christian Provenzano in February 2019. This display helps us see the importance of community participation. In 2019, the calls for justice in the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls asked everyone to become allies and combat racism and break down barriers. Community efforts to make an impact is so important to make changes. So here is just a couple of things on how you can make an impact. So first, develop knowledge. Listen to truth shared and be able to acknowledge the burden of human and Indigenous rights violation and how they impact Indigenous people. Second, use what you have learned and resources to become a strong ally. Being a strong ally involves more than just tolerance, and it means actively working to break down barriers and support others in every relationship and encounter in which you participate. And third, confront and speak out against racism, sexism, ignorance, homophobia, and transphobia, and teach or encourage others to do the same wherever it occurs.
So adding on to what Ripley said, recommendations, a national action plan is a great way to make a national change. The federal government should incorporate more inquiries and listen and learn from the stories of affected Indigenous families who are suffering from these tragic occurrences by working as a whole to create awareness and overall prevent future women and men from being subject to such violence. A huge aspect of these issues still occurring is the broken relationship between Indigenous peoples and the justice system. The treatment of families in many court cases are unsatisfactory. This ultimately causes women to have no faith and be afraid of the justice system as a whole and never seek help. Ultimately, focusing on prevention is ideal. Additionally, ensuring that police are participating in cultural awareness specific to Indigenous people and overall diversity is really important. Raising awareness on the current cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and that are being left unsolved and they're like deemed not foul play. And there is actually a website on CBC of all of the cases, and it just describes like the facts that are there and just the need for national inquiries and calls for justice.
So I'll be talking about some of the organizations that are in place to help with missing and murdered Indigenous women. So one of the main ones I found was NWAC, which stands for Native Women's Association of Canada. It's an organization that aims to support and help find solutions to the issue, along with other key issues they may face. Their main mission statement is to advocate for and inspire women and families of many Indigenous nations. They were established in 1974 for the purpose of representing political needs, bettering policies and procedures, advocating for change in the system, as well as attacking the issues of violence, health, employment, support, and safety, and basically just aim to be inclusive of all Indigenous women and girls, no matter what kind of status they hold. The NWAC's vision statement is we envision an inclusive world that understands and respects the uniqueness of Indigenous women and families. So basically, they want to ensure that Indigenous communities are able to live healthy and safe lives. They also aim to encourage a strong sense of identification and pride in one's culture and encourage learning of their history and traditional ways of life. Their vision as an organization is to work towards all these things in unity with other organizations. Through a set of strategic goals and objectives, this organization aims to be key participants in any key issues involving Indigenous women and children. Their other main goals include providing information, resources to those who need it, encouraging leadership within the community, addressing any issues, promoting equal opportunity, teaching cultural and historical tradition, and assisting other Indigenous women's organizations. And this is just a list of some other ones that you can find online, but they basically have the same goals and objectives. And I think that's the end of the presentation.
All right, guys, thank you very much. I appreciate that. That was incredibly comprehensive, so good for you. Okay, so I'm now going to remove Riley as the host. Okay, and so the next group is group number 4, dealing with family violence. So who would be the host for this group?
I will be presenting the PowerPoint.
Who's this?
Erica.
Okay, Erica, I'll find your name then. Good. Okay, Erica, you're now the host, so you can post your PowerPoint and begin your presentation. Thank you.
Can everyone see it?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. We'll begin. So our topic is acts, legislation, and organizations that are in relation to Indigenous family violence, presented by myself, Jacob, Sarah, Jenna, Gibson, and Belpender.
All right, hi everyone. So basically we're gonna just be going over a brief overview quickly. So family violence is when someone uses abusive behavior to control or harm a member of their family, or someone that they have an intimate relationship with. It doesn't necessarily have to be a family member. This also doesn't have to be a pattern of abuse. It could be a single act or pattern. This abuse does not only have to be physical, as that's the main idea that people think when they hear the word abuse. It could also be psychological. And there are many different forms and factors that play a role into family violence. Some common types that we see are child abuse, intimate partner violence, neglect, elder abuse, violence-based, and so-called honor or forced marriage abuse.
So here is a timeline of all the legislation and organizations that we're going to be talking about today. At the end, we'll also have some statistics related to family violence. So our legislation and organizations goes all the way back to 1892 and all the way up to more current organizations up till 2019. We have the Canadian Criminal Code, the Canadian Evidence Act, Canada's Divorce Act, the Ontario Child and Family Services Act, the Canadian Women's Foundation, the Domestic Violence Protection Act, Spousal Abuse Policies, the Director of Public Prosecutions Act, and Respecting First Nations, Inuit, Métis Children, Youth, and Families.
The Canadian Criminal Code deals with family abuse in section 182 to 192. There are federal, provincial, and territorial laws to protect children from abuse, and they are listed in the criminal code in those sections. However, there is not a specific section dedicated to just family violence, just certain laws that apply to that situation all across Canada. The criminal code does not also contain separate offenses based on the relationship of the victim and the offender. Perpetrators of violent acts against family members can be charged with the appropriate criminal offense, such as homicide, assault, sexual assault, criminal assault. However, the relationship with the offender does not mean the case is more severe than others. However, it does take into accountability the position of a child in a case. This can be very frustrating to family violence survivors or victims because they believe a harsher sentence should be put in place when their victim is someone who is family, especially when it involves a child, because children often see family members as someone they trust and they cannot often see the abuse that is directly happening to them. And that is something that can be very insulting to the individuals who go through these situations.
This is the Canadian Evidence Act, and it was first introduced in 1893, and it regulates all federal law and what is admissible and not admissible in court. The Canadian Evidence Act is supposed to be fair to all, and that is where its importance lies. In the Colton Boushie case, this is not what occurred. Evidence was negligently lost due to the acts of officers. This creates a very uneasy feeling in the Aboriginal community and creates distrust in the system. Overall, this act is supposed to protect people and evidence alike, and in this particular case, it is not. Next slide.
Canada's Divorce Act was developed in 1968, and in order to apply for divorce, there's a set of criteria that must be followed for it to be recognized as legal and acceptable by the courts. This includes that marriage between spouses has been solidified under Canadian law and or recognized in Canada if the marriage happened in the laws of another country. The marriage is broken down, meaning it must meet one of three conditions laid out under the Divorce Act, and one spouse has lived in a Canadian province for a full year immediately before making the application. Canada also has a no-fault divorce, and with this, in order to divorce from your spouse, it must meet one of these requirements. You've been living separate from your spouse for a year or more, your spouse has been physically or mentally abusive to you, or your spouse has committed adultery. This certain set of criteria must be met in order to legally divorce for it to be recognized by the courts. Next slide. The Ontario and Child Family Services Act was developed in 1985. And in order to understand the Ontario Child and Family Services Act, we must first focus on child and youth services. This piece of legislation was designed to give children and youth the ability to their own decision-making, as well as give them more support and make those services available to them more accountable. This act also allows services such as Children's Aid and other licensed residential services to have a stronger front when they're helping a child. In Ontario, some child and family services include, as mentioned previously, Children's Aid Society, that aims to protect children from being abused in their homes, provides foster care services, and modernizes children and youth services. Association of Native Child and Family Services Agencies of Ontario. They promote a healthy relationship with Indigenous children seeking a better life while still making it important for them to be a part of a cultural-based service. And the Ministry of Child and Youth Services. This includes programming that ranges from child welfare to mental health aids, as well as autism or special needs programming. Each service that is listed above, as well as an abundance of others, offer Indigenous family support and can successfully aid in helping those families to make better choices while still feeling like they have control over their own decision-making. Next slide.
This is the Canadian Women's Foundation, and they have four main goals. That is to end violence against women, give women economic security, empower women, and inclusive leadership. They also have a very diverse spectrum of gender inclusion, including women, girls, trans, genderqueer, non-binary, and 2S LGBTQ+. It was first founded in 1991 by the senator at the time, Nancy Ruth, and her friend Susan Woods. The focus is to provide equal rights, responsibilities, and opportunities for women. The Canadian Women Foundation is a nonprofit organization and is very important to the Aboriginal community and Aboriginal women in particular. The rate of violence against Aboriginal women is still much higher than that of Canadian women. Part of the problem can be explained by looking at political, historical, and social and economical climates. The Canadian Women's Foundation is crucial in supporting these women through shelter, workshops, financial support, and therapy. This foundation is very impactful and has assisted many Aboriginal women and will continue to do so. Next slide.
The Domestic Violence Protection Act of 2000. Different provincial legislation for domestic violence can include cases involving physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. threats, and property damage. Legislators, justice workers, and members of numerous social organizations banded together in 2000 in response to the PC government's creation of Bill 111, an act to better protect victims of domestic violence. This bill was passed in September of 2000 by the Mike Harris government. Bill 117 was the first time the Ontario provincial government proposed a classification of domestic violence, framed as one more move we are taking to defend victims of domestic violence and keep suspects accountable. The important themes of this act are that everyone is responsible, protection and gender, rights and gender, funding and fairness, numerical and statistical truths, language and resistance. This will help many Indigenous families to receive justice from their abusive partners and offer further protection.
Spousal abuse policies are about the violence against one's current or former spouse, common law, or other intimate partner. These policies are often described as pro-charging and not pro-prosecution policies, which is a serious issue with them, honestly. Pro-charging means that they get sent with a charge and no to less prosecution time. And this puts the victim to still be at risk. Some individuals that we see through statistics at higher risk are younger Canadians aged 15 to 24, particularly young women, persons living in common law relationships, people whose partners abuse alcohol, people living with very controlling and emotionally abusive partners, Aboriginal women, and women undergoing separation. The ad hoc FPT working group reviewing spousal abuse policies and legislation was established in November of 2000. They touched on how spousal abuse is a serious and complex issue with multiple dimensions and causes. It manifests itself in societies and across all social classes. It can go by different names, including violence against women in relationships, spousal abuse, partner abuse, and in some societies, it's remain nameless because people don't want to make it a publicly recognized as something because they want it to be seen as a private matter. So that's what the ad hoc FPT working group reviewing spousal policies and legislation does is they make sure that the individuals that are at higher risk work together on a situation that it's not considered pro-charging, but also some pro-prosecution, because we want to make sure that these individuals that are at higher risk have a better chance of justice.
The Director of Public Prosecutions Act from 2018. They take into consideration special circumstances when dealing with family violence cases. Special considerations can include the family not having access to resources, continued contact with the abuser, and financial dependency. The most important factor is to protect the immediate family that has been affected by the abuse or is at risk to be. Evidence needed in order to prosecute, and the evidence that is most necessary to ensure that is the safest result for the family includes whether there has been a threat of or physical abuse. It must be taken into consideration in deciding whether to deal with this through the court system is the best way to deal with it. One consideration in this is whether it is a reoccurring issue within the family. It also needs to be considered whether the accused is willing to go through a treatment, program, or healing circle in order to rectify their abusive behavior. An option is a judicial interim release, is when the victim expresses wishes of reconciliation and for the accused to be released of custody. The Crown must ensure that no member of the family is in danger by doing so. If the Crown is pleased that there is no immediate risk, then certain restrictions can be put in place to ensure the safety of the family. Such restrictions can include restriction from seeing the victim, surrendering firearms, refraining from the use of drugs and alcohol, or attending a related program or healing circle to reconcile with their past actions. In the preparation of witnesses, if it is best decided that the route is to proceed through the court system, then the victim must decide whether they are willing to testify. For many, this is traumatizing to go back through what has happened to them. In preparing the witness, it must also be taken into consideration if the witness will change their mind or potentially lie about the events. If the victim does not feel comfortable testifying, then they can have a sworn videotape statement instead. If a witness fails to attend or testify, without that testimony, it is likely that the case will be dismissed. Alternative options to prosecution can still be explored. Within sentencing, it is completely dependent on the situation, and the most important thing is to ensure the safety of the victim and their family. Alternatives to prosecution is having the victim involved in a healing circle and encouraging other community members to be present as well to reconcile as a collective unit. In this alternative, the accused must take responsibility for the actions they have committed. Within this alternative to prosecution, it is not always the best choice. In instances where there was sexual violence, a serious impact on the victim, or where it was a part of a larger crime. In connection to Indigenous families within the Indigenous communities, the recurring factor is to try and solve any issue of family violence within a community healing circle. This is where the victim becomes more involved with the entire process and usually will receive more closure from doing so.
Chain for family violence in the home. Indigenous family violence is a public emergency. The act representing First Nations and Inuit and Métis children, youths, and family. This act allows Indigenous communities the power to use its own jurisdiction for youth, as well as to support and provide services to the family structure. Better representation and change for Indigenous youth to be rehabilitated with elders in order to stop violence at a young age that can continue into family violence in the future. Next slide.
Just some statistics. 1 in 4 victims of violent crime was victimized by a spouse or other family member. There are almost 99,000 victims of family violence in 2010, accounting for 1/4 of all police reported victims of violent crimes. Almost an equal proportion of these family violence victims were spouses, 49%, or other types of family members such as children, parents, siblings, or extended family members, which is 51%. In 2010, there was 294 victims of family violence for every 100,000 Canadians. This police reported rate of family violence was similar to the rate of stranger violence, 307 per 100,000, but was nearly half the rate involving acquaintances or friends, 574 per 100,000. However, these statistics are just on family abuse as a whole. When looking deeper into statistics of spousal abuse, data from 1999 indicated that 8% of women, 690,000, and 7% of men, 549,000, reported experiencing at least one incident of violence by a current or previous partner during a 5-year period. Overall, this amounts to 7% of adult Canadians. This has increased to 20% for Indigenous peoples, 25% of women, and 13% of men.
This is a brief look at the statistics between Indigenous and non-Indigenous women. So from 2014, Indigenous women of self-reported sexual assault was 113 per 1,000, while non-Indigenous women self-reported 35 per 1,000. And up to 2016, Indigenous women are also 3 times more likely to be assaulted by their current or former spouse than non-Indigenous women. And we must take into consideration that these numbers would be higher if all women reported.
These are some statistics about family violence in Indigenous communities and compared to outside of communities. As mentioned before, police reported family violence calls from self-identifying Indigenous persons accounted for 9% of calls, while calls from non-Indigenous persons for family violence accounted for 4% of calls. The problem that with these numbers is that the information that's being collected, there's such a fear of police in Indigenous communities because of the discrimination that they get from the system. They are less likely to not call police or report these crimes. So the numbers are hard to accurately display. Next slide. Family violence in Indigenous communities, the factors that contributed to family violence and still continue to in Indigenous communities are the fear of police, lack of social institution and counseling, and youth crime and incarceration rates. This act helps because it takes away the behavior from youth. If they are committing youth crime, it allows them the ability to go with the elders in the community to be rehabilitated and taught the proper ways in order to conduct themselves, so that it breaks the bad habit of violence in the home. Next slide.
If you, your child, or a family member have been physically or sexually assaulted or threatened, you should immediately call your local police services. There they have reasonable grounds to lay a charge, or they may even make arrest. You can call them at 705-253-1600. The Sault Ste. Marie City Police also have a section on their website that you can report your crime without calling. You can do this anonymously, and they have a tab specifically for youth in our community and services to offer them as well. Some other options are the Ontario Network of Sexual and Domestic Abuse, the 24/7 Domestic Abuse Hotline, Assaulted Women's Helpline, the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Program, and the Talk for Healing telephone helpline and online chat counseling services. I also link some local services here. We have the Batchewana First Nation Family Crisis Shelter, and their phone number is linked in the Algoma Family Services Violence Against Women's extension and phone number is also linked to this slide.
In conclusion, these collections of acts, legislation, and organizations shown that the law and society has evolved in terms of responding to acts of family violence. The most important thing to remember is the safety of the victim and their family. The rates of family violence are still much higher within Indigenous communities. And within these Indigenous communities, the best way to reconcile past actions is through a healing circle, which can further involve the victim and the community as a whole. And that is the end.
Okay, thank you very much, guys. I appreciate that. Okay, Erica, I'm going to discontinue you as the host, and we're moving on to group number 5, which deals with residential schools. So who's going to be the host for this group?
I'm going to host this one, Larissa Davey.
All right, Larissa, okay, I'll find your name. Okay, I'm getting it. There we go. Good.
Perfect.
Okay, Larissa, you're the host now, so you can share your PowerPoint and your group can present. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so our group will be, our topic is residential schools in Canada. Okay, so I'm Shannon. We have Corey, Larissa, Carolina, Chelsea, Karina, and Ava in our group. Okay, so the treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history. 2 primary objectives of the residential school systems were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their homes, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. So this quote further explains the intentions of residential schools in Canada. So residential schools were first established in 1831 and was a teaching ground for over 150,000 students and changed the lives of many. Residential schools were a way to change the behavior and mindset of so many children in order to modernize their behavior and to be placed into non-Indigenous families. Those who ran the residential schools were abusing the children mentally and physically, which also left them to be mentally unstable in their adult years. Furthermore, residential schools ended in 1966. The residential schools were also a government-funded organization, which is where the majority of their funding came from. Many of the provinces were involved, except for a few, including Newfoundland, PEI, and New Brunswick. In total, there were approximately 80 residential schools spread out across Canada. Next slide, please. So in addition to the 150,000 individuals involved, those faced upwards of 40 to 60% of a mortality rate as they grew up and began to understand what actually happened during their youth. That being said, most of them would commit suicide or self-harm, and everyone must attend. So those growing up, they were ordered, I guess, by the government to attend these classes in schools. Next slide. So finally, here's a short video, an overview of what residential schools are and how they operate.
Oh, Lord.
On this slide, we will discuss the school's creation and environment. And as the Canadian government gained control over the Aboriginal land and peoples by disruption of their governments and economies, their goal was to repress the Aboriginal cultures and diminish their spiritual practices. The government, in partnership often with religious bodies such as churches, sought to civilize and Christianize and ultimately assimilate the students. Each student had a number used instead of their names, as well as boys and girls were separated, and often so were the siblings. The abduction methods included pulling into front yards of houses and simply taking the children into cars, vans, and such without notifying the parents. Further, our own Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, apologized to the former students of Canada's residential schools in 2008, calling it a sad chapter in our history. His reference is to the period of time when the Canadian government gained control over Aboriginal land and peoples. That disruption of governments and economies occurred, and we cannot deny it. Next slide, please. On this slide, we feature the assimilation pictures. Here we can see pictures of Indian people that were documented actually for purposes of showing that they're being civilized rather than to document the genocide. The images are now being studied for the purposes of genocides, but before they were simply just to document the changes. And as you can see, they're quite visible. Next slide, please. And moving forward, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was negotiated in 2006, and it was implemented in 2007. And I'll pass it on to the next presenter.
I'm going to play a short video for all of you about what reconciliation is according to a couple professionals.
So what is reconciliation anyway? There's a number of things that are not reconciliation. Hiring more Indigenous peoples is not reconciliation. Having more artwork in offices is not reconciliation. We should already be doing these things.
Before how I can help comes as a question, I think they first need to understand.
All you need is access to Google, and you'll be able to get onto the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's website and read the report. And even if you don't want to read it, you can read it in YouTube videos, have it read to you.
And then not just know the truth, but there's the justice part where you actually address and make amends for everything that's happened and is still happening.
The reality is that First Nations kids are still getting between 20 to 50% less funding across every public service.
So until there's no more murdered and missing Indigenous women or our people over incarcerated in prison, how can we skip forward to the fun reconciliation part of things?
There is no federal plan to eliminate those inequalities. And some people say, well, you know, there must be a reason for this. But let's take boil water advisories. The Government of Canada can get a DART team in the air, fly them to an earthquake zone halfway around the world and get clean water pumping in 24 hours. So why can't they do that for First Nations communities in Canada? We're making choices to allow the racial discrimination to continue. And that's what we need to stop.
We will never get to real truth, justice, and reconciliation until there is a substantial transfer of power, wealth, and resources. And that means lands have to come back. That also means there has to be us sharing in the resources. And it also means a recognition and full implementation of our sovereign right to be self-determining.
When you think about the greatest human rights abuses that were done in Canada, the Chinese head tax, the internment of Japanese Canadians, and residential school, they all have two things in common. First, they were all perpetrated by the Canadian government. And second, we all let it happen because we couldn't watch the injustice and speak up and do something about it. Reconciliation is our chance to learn how to not turn away.
If I help these people in professional positions or positions of power understand what it is Indigenous people have been going through and have gone through, it's going to help my children in school right now. It's going to help their children, and it's going to help, 7 generations.
That's why I never talk about reconciliation without talking about truth, justice, and reconciliation. You won't get that from hanging artwork in an office.
Help TVO create.
So what is
So from that video, you can tell that it's a loaded subject. There's a lot of people that suffered and unfairly. This slide is going to be covering the Common Experience Payment. So the Common Experience Payment is where the Government of Canada pays all eligible former students who endured abuse within the system. It was acknowledged that the pain and suffering that they endured was inhumane and cruel. Assessment for the payment covered claims of sexual and serious physical abuse. The fund was and is meant to support healing. That way, the people that had to sustain the abuse mentioned were able to get the help that they needed, because a lot of communities would suffer from a lot of heartache and pain from this, because it wasn't the children that only suffered, it was the parents too. There's the independent assessment process, which essentially would be a system of peers, and when I say peers, I mean people within the Indigenous communities, so elders and other respected positions, and then government officials that would come together and they would talk about the cases that happened. And essentially it was an out-of-court process. That way no one felt the pressures of the court and what was happening. The IAP is one of the two components of the IRSSA. The other part is the CEP, ensuring that victims are paid. Applications for the process were accepted until September 19, 2012, at which case they stopped. But at this point, at their cutoff point, there was over 80,000 cases. There was 3 categories of claims, so sexual and physical assault, and the first category was by caretakers, so you would see that as nuns, priests, and other people in positions of power of the school. And essentially this would cover very non-consensual activities that did happen, and as much as we wish it didn't happen, there's no way around that. Number 2 is the sexual and physical assault from one student to another. So basically the staff were obligated to protect the students even from each other, and the staff failed. There's no excuse for them failing, and There's no excuse that can ever be offered to the victims that had to endure that. And number three is any wrongful acts that cause long-lasting psychological damage. And it's fair enough to say that even being in a system where you were forced to be in the part of genocide is enough to leave damage that will severely impact you for the rest of your life. Resolution health support programs were offered in place for the people that were coming into the meetings. So basically the government set it up where you would have emotional supports that would be like family or even seeing psychologists, therapists, anything that you needed. Cultural supports, you would have elders and those within the Indigenous communities that were trained for these kinds of situations. Professional counseling, which would allow you to see a psychologist and make sure that you weren't going to go through anything that would trigger PTSD or any other long-term effects while speaking about the case in front of everyone. And there was the assistance with transportation, because realistically, transportation isn't easy for everyone. Not everyone has access to vehicles or an area where they can get to buses. So this was the government's way of ensuring that these people had a chance to stand in court and out of court and have their voices heard, that they wouldn't just be forgotten in the masses. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was a key component of the IRSSA. Basically, through all the processes that happened and all the different parts of the court coming together, you would hear from the stories of victims, the real telling events, and it was come together basically, essentially, that something had to change, that there was something wrong here, and that these people deserved better than what they were being given, because we essentially put a bunch of people into a school without consideration of their heritage, culture, their parents, and we told them, this is how it is. And the government acknowledged through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada that this wasn't okay, that we had to change. The TRO's final report came with a lot of upset, but good upset. And one of the prime videos that you would see looking through this kind of things, and I remember this stuck with me, was an old man unwrapping a photo, and he holds up the photo to the crowd and he says, do you see all these faces? There's 36 faces, and I want you to remember these faces. There's only 9 of us left. And you would hear testaments like this through the whole speech. And it was just a very emotional moment. And it came to the point where Justin Trudeau actively admitted that there had to be changes and that the government was willing to work with the Indigenous communities, because what happened was an atrocity that should have never happened in the first place. I'll be handing off my section now to another speaker.
The reconciliation did bring justice, and it is bringing it right now as we speak, but it did also bring stories of the survivors into light. There's also a myth circulating in Canada and maybe elsewhere that residential schools existed a very long time ago. Most of us don't realize that they did exist to mid 1970s, and actually the last federally run residential school just closed in 1996 in Saskatchewan. As the reconciliation committee proceeded, a lot of stories came to light, such as Howard Stacey's, who was taken without his parents' knowledge from a public school in Port Renfrew, British Columbia. And I will just read off his account of the kidnapping by the school. I was kidnapped from Port Renfrew's elementary school when I was around 6 years old, and this happened right in the elementary schoolyard. My aunt witnessed it, and so did my mother. And I would continue on, but you can, of course, all Google it. and read the rest of it. Accounts like that are numerous, and there's another one that I would like to share with you, and this one comes from Victoria McIntosh, who really disliked porridge, but as I will read from her own account. And there was an accident where I wouldn't eat porridge, and the first time, and I looked down and there was a ball in front of me, and I noticed there was worms in it, and I wouldn't eat it, and the nun come behind me, and she told me, eat it, and I wouldn't eat it, just no, and she slammed my face in it. And I would continue, but again, you can read the rest of it on your own. I'll pass it on to the next member as I exhaust the survivors slide.
So I think the survivors slide is very important, since there was a time when the Canadian population believed that the Aboriginal population was ceasing to exist. And our Constitution Act actually played a big role in the genocide of our Aboriginal peoples. So the BNA Act was drafted by Canadians in 1864, and it was passed without amendment by the British Parliament. The act was later signed by Queen Victoria, and it came into effect on July 1st, 1867. The BNA Act essentially set down rules for the federal government, and it set down a base for the Canadian Constitution that is today. The Indian Act was later enacted in 1876 due to the federal government being in charge of Indian affairs. This act allowed the government to control some parts of Aboriginal life, such as Indian status, such as numbered cards being handed out, the lands, such as Aboriginals being forced onto reservations. Indigenous lands were sold back only by signing treaties, as well as administration. First Nation bands were created strategically to prevent the rise of an uprising or rebellion against the state, and education. Sir A. Macdonald, the Prime Minister, actually commissioned for a report that'll help them advance Canadian residential schools. A man by the name of Nicholas Flood Davin, he was an American writer who studied the American education system and how they schooled Indians, such as the Cherokee. He wrote a report that advised the Canadian government and the feds of where the funds should be dispersed and how. Fundamentally, the goal behind these schools was to assimilate and civilize. Next slide, please. So the Davin report was applied to the feds to receive their funding. With this funding, missionaries were hired, such as the church, to provide teachers and education. And in return, the government provided facilities miles and miles away from the nearest Indian reservation. The RCMP also provided law enforcement for the nuns and priests when the families refused to give up their children. The parents were not the only ones who suffered from the hands of the RCMP. The children were monitored and unable to leave the school grounds for fear the police would find them. None of them could call the police when the police were also the ones abusing them and keeping them locked up in these schools. There was also no escape, since there was only one place for these Indian children to run to. The Aboriginal parents who refused to give up their children were meant to be bargained with for extra rations and livestock. It was actually advised by the Davin report that the police were to let the parents know that they were breaking the law. And I think it was very obvious that the RCMP took these recommendations very lightly. On the next slide, I have a video. It's a story of a boy who attempted to escape a residential school, and he was later found dead by a river, and the story is told by his sister.
A young boy trying to escape. It was 1966 when Chani Wenjack ran away from a residential school. His body was found near railroad tracks a week later. He was only 12. A New Heritage Minute tells his story through the voice of his sister Pearl.
I survived residential school. My brother Johnny did not.
For John Custer, watching it brings back painful memories of his own experience.
Many times boys would run away, the girls would run away, and if we were caught, they would shave our heads and beat the hell out of you.
Custer was one of more than 150,000 children forced to attend residential school in the 19th and 20th centuries. He's now part of a group that holds an annual reunion for survivors and their families. He believes there are still people who don't fully know what really happened.
It was a reality. For me, it's nice to talk about it once in a while to get rid of it.
The Minute was written by Canadian author Joseph Boyden.
Seeing that little boy on the railroad track dead because he went to a school that was supposed to give him an education is very disturbing.
They forced him to go to the Indian residential school.
Doris Young was a member of an advisory committee with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and spent years in residential school. She says while this might help educate, she would prefer to see something positive launch on Aboriginal Day.
We're supposed to be out there dancing and making, telling our children what wonderful people they are.
Action. For Historica Canada, it's important to recognize all parts of Canadian history to move forward.
Only by understanding those mistakes, those things we've done poorly in our history, those things of which we're less proud, do we improve as a country.
In 1966, Chani Wenjack's death triggered the first inquest into the treatment of students at residential schools, but his family wasn't allowed to attend. Alana Cole, CBC News, Winnipeg. A young boy.
I don't think this was a part of anyone's slide. My last one was the last
This
slide.
wasn't my slide. Okay, following that is residential schools and the correlation to prison systems. Residential schools are believed to be continued through the justice system in Canada. Many children from residential schools in the 60s scoop later grew up with a lot of traumatic experiences, later leading to poor coping mechanisms, which caused many Indigenous people to be incarcerated due to related charges. Residential schools did many injustices to the children who later grew up to cause intergenerational trauma amongst their family and children unknowingly. Next slide. Residential schools and similarities are that all students had to obey blindly to the teachers. Many punishments that were received were corporal punishment, confinement, starvation, physically, sexually, and mentally abused. The Indigenous people who attended residential schools were treated as offenders and were at high risk of being physically and sexually abused by the authority figures. Indigenous people in Canada are also systematically disadvantaged and imprisoned due to many factors such as addiction, homelessness, and petty crimes. Many of the incarcerations of Indigenous people today can root all the way back to intergenerational trauma caused by residential schools. Incarceration rates, Indigenous people in Canada account for 30% of the federally incarcerated population of Indigenous. Indigenous people only make up 4% of the national population. Indigenous women are 3 times more likely to be victims of violent crimes than non-Indigenous women. The Indigenous population is 58% more likely to be victims of crime than non-Indigenous, and those are the stats. And this is a video on how they're related to residential schools. You can start at like 50 seconds, I think.
Can you see the screen right now? Or is it still on the slideshow?
No,
It's on the screen. It's sharing.
Okay.
You just have to make it a big screen, I think.
Let me get to...
Ontario's COVID-19 vaccine plan is helping to stop the spread and save lives. Your turn is coming soon. Learn more about Ontario's vaccine plan. Paid for by the Government of Ontario.
Yeah? Yeah. Okay.
Here we go.
Plains Associate Editor Nancy McDonald. Hi, Nancy. And
Your article exposes injustices in the justice system, and especially how they deal with Indigenous people, from the jails to the courts to the police. So let's begin with what you've discovered about the crime rates.
Well, I think the first thing we found was that while crime rates in Canada have been plummeting and have been for the last few decades, for one group of the population, for the Indigenous population, they're soaring. You've got a situation where in some prairie jails, you'll have 90% of the women there are Indigenous, 65, 70% of the men are Indigenous. Across the country, it's about 1/3.
Now, you've also found out that the number of Indigenous people incarcerated is actually worse than at the height of apartheid in South Africa. That to me is shocking.
Absolutely. I mean, look, there are a couple examples we turn to when we want to look at the asymmetric jailing of minority populations in the United States, South Africa. Canada is in fact worse. In the US, if you're black, you're 6 times more likely to be jailed. In Canada, if you're Indigenous, you're 10 times more likely to be jailed. In certain parts of the country, like Saskatchewan, you're 33 times more likely to be jailed. It's worse than what existed in South Africa at the height of apartheid.
Wow. Now, you mentioned Saskatchewan. Are there other regions of the country that are worse than others?
Well, you're speaking to me from Western Canada. Things are worse here, particularly on the prairies in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. That's where we're seeing a lot of these very shocking figures. Lawyers tell me in some prairie courtrooms you'll have as many as 85% of defendants in criminal cases are Indigenous.
Wow. All right, Nancy, thanks for joining us.
What is intergenerational trauma and how is it caused? Due to the impact of the residential school system, many children have endured psychological, moral, emotional, and physical abuse at the hands of their presumed caregivers. Intergenerational trauma, also referred to as transgenerational trauma by researchers, is a rapidly expanding field. The phenomenon is also often researched as a part of historical trauma. Residential schools have existed for years. Owing to a lack of experience with caring family settings, survivors suffered from chronic trauma. As a result, parents became ill-equipped to parent their own children. Furthermore, as evidence of the effects of these abusive family arrangements, high rates of family abuse and partner harassment have resulted. Residential school survivors, children, and grandchildren have also taken the burden of their parents' and grandparents' physical and emotional pain. In sociocultural, psychological, forms, trauma is passed down through generations. Others examine racism, social discrimination, and economic marginalization as other issues. Next slide, please. And here is a video outlining residential schools and how intergenerational trauma has occurred as a result.
The goal was to resolve the so-called Indian problem. So in 1883, the Canadian government officially instituted the residential school system. By the 1930s, nearly 75% of Indigenous children between the ages of 7 and 15 were forced to attend these schools. Unable to return home for months or even years, Indigenous children were often neglected and abused, stripped of their language and culture. Thousands of children died while at residential school. Others went missing, never to be seen again. At least 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were institutionalized over the course of more than 100 years. There are approximately 80,000 living survivors. Some have become leaders in their communities, teachers, counselors, commissioners. For many, the trauma of the mental, physical, and sexual abuse they suffered hasn't faded. The children and grandchildren of survivors have inherited those wounds. They have persisted, manifesting as depression, anxiety, family violence, suicidal thoughts, substance use. This is called intergenerational trauma, and it can take generations to heal. For Indigenous peoples, that healing can involve a return to the culture that was taken from them. For others, it involves formal acknowledgement of their experiences.
There is no place in Canada for the attitudes that inspired the Indian residential school system to ever prevail again.
For Canada, it means confronting the past and working towards reconciliation. Laws and apologies are necessary to help us move forward, but reconciliation also requires true understanding and empathy to create space where healing is possible. The goal was to resolve.
Intergenerational trauma is rooted in forced social and legal injustices in the form of racial, colonial, and genocidal policies like the reservation system and the residential school system for Indigenous peoples in Canada. Injustices are detailed in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, or the RCAP report, as well as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. Indigenous people have demonstrated remarkable strength and are making significant progress in their healing. And I'd like to pass it on to Ava.
So, when talking about the transfer of intergenerational trauma, there are many different theories on how exactly the trauma is passed down through generations. There's the sociocultural model, the psychological model, and the physiological model. The first model focuses on the environment in which Indigenous children grew up. It basically explains that if a child goes through trauma, is not shown love from a parent or within the community that they live in, which can be caused from racism, amongst other issues when you're not with your own community, or they could experience abuse. They likely won't have the skills or experience to be able to produce a stable environment for their own family or their own children. To be good parents or to teach your children what is right versus wrong, typically one needs to have been taught that or experienced that themselves. Unfortunately, due to the past trauma, which was caused within residential schools, many of these survivors are unable to provide the right type of environment for their own children, which continues the cycle of trauma as they will continue treating their children the same way, and it just continues. Next slide. The second model is the psychological model. It looks at more so the unique relationship between parent and child, like of an infant, and the impact that it can have on a child's early development to not be properly cared for, or for their mother to feel as if she doesn't have the connection with the child that someone who experienced good parenting in their own life would be able to pass on to their own children. Oftentimes, if the kids' needs aren't met or they don't feel safe with their immediate family, the series suggests that it could cause cognitive delays, which could affect the child in school, and then as well as the rest of their lives. And the final model is the physiological model. This model focuses more on the biological and genetic factors. The theory details how toxic stress, which can be induced by environmental factors, can also permanently affect a person's ability to handle stressful situations. This is actually able to be passed down, and children can be predisposed to this condition if their parents have this, which often was developed because of the stressful, traumatic situations that they were in. This theory looks at how also stress on pregnant women can affect the development of their baby. So there's many different environmental factors that can cause biological or genetic factors. The theory basically explains that many people struggle with the ability to be able to self-regulate their behavior while under stress, and it explains how genetic factors play quite a significant role alongside environmental factors as well. And yeah, thank you.
That's it for our presentation. Thank you all for listening. We appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Great job. All right, so Larissa, I'll relieve you of your duties, and I will. Yeah, there you go. And this is our last group coming up, dealing with the environment. So who is going to be the host for this group?
It'll be me, Farhang, but this isn't my laptop, so it'll be Mona and Zoom.
Okay, all right, so I'm gonna, I had more there for a second. Okay, Mona, you're the host, so your group can take it from here.
All right, hi everyone. Our group will be covering environmental issues with Tom, Vanessa, Harish, Sakshi, Balveen, and myself, Farhang, with a specific focus on the Canadian pipeline and railway protests. But before getting into that, it's important to it is important to say why the environment is significant to Indigenous cultures and communities. So Indigenous communities have deeply rooted respect for the environment and place value and honor in protecting it. But they're not one homogeneous group, so this spiritual connection may vary, but it is still tied to the idea of stewardship and responsibility over the land, sea, and all the creatures which they share it with. Sacred sites are the very heart of traditional lands and can be anywhere from buffalo jumps or sweat lodges, to name a few. So oral traditions, language, cultural practices, and also traditional ecological knowledge, or tech, maintain this sense of responsibility over time. Tech is just handed down knowledge through generations through traditional songs, stories, and beliefs, and is concerned with the relationship of living beings with their traditional groups and with their environment. So, in essence, an attack on the environment will also undermine their culture, identity, and their ability to survive. There are a few important Supreme cases to just briefly go through. Silcoteen in British Columbia in 2014 provided First Nations with improved opportunities to advance their Aboriginal title and rights in a manner that reflects their vision, values, and perspectives. Crown and Sparrow set out the criteria to determine whether the government infringement on Aboriginal rights are justifiable, providing that they were in existence at the time of Constitution Act 1982, the criteria through the Sparrow test. And Delgamuukw in British Columbia in 1997, which was the first comprehensive account of Aboriginal title when the Kingston and the Wet'suwet'en peoples claimed Aboriginal title and jurisdiction over 58,000 square kilometers in northwest British Columbia. While they lost the case, the Supreme Court of Canada allowed the appeal in part and ordered a new trial to describe the nature and scope of the protections given to Aboriginal title and clarified how the justification test for Crown and Sparrow applies when Aboriginal title is infringed. But there are also plenty of rights recognized under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, when Article 3 recognizes Indigenous right to their own development, and Article 29, Section 1, the right to conservation and protection of the environment. Now, the outline will cover the relevant parties and the actual projects themselves. So Wet'suwet'en First Nations are located on Bulkley River and around Burns Lake and are a member of the Carrier-Sakoney Tribal Council, which focuses on heritage, identity, and self-governance. Their traditional form of governance is a system of hereditary chiefs representing each clan, which are themselves represented by the nonprofit Office of the Wet'suwet'en. TransCanada Corporation is a major North American energy company which transports more than 25% of North American natural gas demand and ships 20% of Western Canadian exports of crude oil. Its initial purpose was to develop the Canadian mainline to supply Eastern Canadian markets with natural gas produced in the West. In June 2012, TransCanada was selected by Shell and liquefied natural gas partners, Korea Gas, Mitsubishi, and PetroChina, to design and operate the Coastal GasLink pipeline near Dawson Creek and the liquefied natural gas storage and export facility in the port of Kitimat on the Douglas Channel. Investment and construction decisions were confirmed by 2018, and they were set for completion by 2024 to 25. The Coastal GasLink itself, the pipeline, passes through several First Nations peoples' territories, including some that are unceded. Prior to construction, alternative routes called for by the Wet'suwet'en were rejected due to longer distances, closer proximities to urban communities, and believing that the consultations would just push back development time. But in the end, approval was given by 20 elected First Nation band councils, including the Wet'suwet'en elected band council, along the proposed route. And as part of this agreement, TransCanada would award $620 million in contract worth to Northern British Columbian First Nations. Now, we'll cover the timeline, some opponents, proponents, the environmental challenges, and the protests that took place. According to Hereditary Chief Namox, this runs through their territory and threatens their water rights, title, and jurisdiction, and also goes through areas of cultural significance to the Wet'suwet'en. As we discussed before, this is an attack on their very identity. After the Delgamuukw decision, the Wet'suwet'en and Giksan entered the treaty process with the BC government, but walked from the process after finding out they would only be receiving 46% of their territory. And as a result, the Wet'suwet'en and Giksan nations' traditional territories are not yet recognized in Canadian law. And in the absence of this, the hereditary chief's position is that Coastal GasLink requires their full consent to operate within their territory, which they lack. Other opposition to the project also note that the Wet'suwet'en territory was never ceded to the government since the colonies did not enter into treaties with the First Nation peoples over much of the territory, including the Wet'suwet'en people, before joining Canada. And they argue that the Wet'suwet'en people still retain title over traditional land due to this. Also, the hereditary chiefs claim responsibility over the protection towards the traditional territory lands and argue that the role of the elected band councils are only to impose or to maintain reserves under the Indian Act, not to decide what happens with the land. While other opposition on the pipeline is based on environmental grounds. Liquefied natural gas is considered non-toxic and has low water solubility. So in the event of a pipeline accident, the atmosphere is damaged. The atmospheric damage is the most prominent alongside the risk of a forest fire. Its construction increases regional emissions, with the pipeline's full working capacity estimated to release up to 5.54% of British Columbia's yearly greenhouse gas emissions. Out of the minimum of 21 animal species, which includes the western screech owl, grizzly bears, local orca, the Talqua and the Heart Range caribou herds are predicted to experience the most significant impacts, already being on the provincial animal conservation list. It is estimated that 129 out of the 459 Heart Range caribou herds will be directly affected by the Coastal GasLink pipeline project, and that 32% of the herd's functional habitat will be disturbed, whereas for the Talqua caribou, there's only about 20 of them left, so they'll most likely be wiped out entirely. Proponents of this project include the First Nations Liquefied Natural Gas Alliance, point towards opportunities of Indigenous contracting, and they argue that First Nations should be included within resource development. So protests began at the beginning of began in 2010 when the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs and their supporters set up barricades and checkpoints along the Morris West Forest Service Road, blocking access to the construction of pipeline projects that threaten their territory. In 2018, after TransCanada Energy received its partner's go-ahead in November, it appealed to the Supreme Court of British Columbia to grant an injunction to stop the blockade, which the BC Supreme Court issued, allowing Coastal GasLink to begin pre-construction work. In 2019, January 7th, the RCMP conducted a raid to enforce TransCanada Energy's injunction, removing the barricades on the Morris Forest Service Road and arresting 14 of the Wet'suwet'en land offenders. And on January 1st, 2020, after rejecting the injunction, the hereditary chiefs ordered the eviction of the RCMP and Coastal GasLink personnel from the Wet'suwet'en territory. 30 days later, the RCMP announced they would stand down while the hereditary chiefs, if the hereditary chiefs and the province met to discuss and come to terms to an agreement. But by February 4th, the talks had broken down and the RCMP began removing the blockades on the Wet'suwet'en territory, arresting 28 land offenders, which were all released within 2 days. Then moving on to solidarity protests, they began on January 20th, 2020, with the disruption of the British Columbia's ferry service leaving from Swartz Bay. Further protests blocked the Port of Vancouver teleport before the Metro Vancouver Police began enforcing an injunction. On February 15th, over 200 people in Toronto blocked the Macmillan Yard, and a day later, Rainbow Bridge was also blocked. Other First Nations activists targeted railway lines near Belleville, Ontario, when members of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte First Nation began a blockade of the Canadian National Railway just south of the Tyendinaga Mohawk territory on February 6th, causing Via Rail to cancel trains under Toronto to Montreal and Toronto to Ottawa routes. On October the 1st, 2020, an ongoing hearing began in the BC Supreme Court, where the Office of the Wet'suwet'en requested that the court eject the Environmental Assessment Office's decision to extend Coastal GasLink environmental certificate for 5 years. Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs later achieved a milestone by signing a memorandum of understanding, which affirms the provincial and Canadian government's recognition that Wet'suwet'en traditional authorities hold territorial rights and title under their system of governance, and outlines a process for negotiating shared jurisdiction. While this does not entirely resolve the battle over the Coastal GasLink, it has created a path towards negotiation on Wet'suwet'en rights and title, meaning that the government will finally recognize that hereditary chiefs have a role in managing the territory in the future. Thank you for your time.
Is that the group's presentation?
Yes.
Oh, thank you very much. All right, guys. Again, I'll take back the hosting. All right, thank you everybody for hanging in here. It's gone to almost 9:30. Your presentations were absolutely excellent. They were all incredibly comprehensive. Did a really, really good job on portraying the fact situations relevant to your topics, and basically providing knowledge to the rest of your classmates on those topics. So thank you very much. Again, please send me your scorecards or score sheets that I sent you by way of Google Form. So return those to me, and then you will receive your participation marks for doing that. Again, if you're doing a final paper for this class, please have it to me by the end of day on Friday. That's April 23rd. And for those of you doing a final exam, be here next Monday evening. That's April the 26th at 7 p.m. All right, guys, thank you very much. And if I don't talk to you again, I appreciate your absolutely wonderful participation in this course. It's been a treat for me to teach it to you. Hopefully you've learned something that you think has been worthwhile. And take care.